We're winding down coverage of AMD's Vega at this point, but wanted to explore shaders at least one more time prior to moving on to other tasks. In our initial AMD shader comparison between Vega 56 and Vega 64, we saw identical performance between the cards when clock matched at roughly 1580 to 1590 MHz core and 945 MHz HBM2. We're now exploring performance across a range of frequency settings from 1400 MHz core to 1660 MHz core and from 800 to 1050 MHz HBM2. This video is brought to you by the Be Quiet Dark Base Pro 900 White Edition. The DBP 900 marks a return to full tower cases, equipped with ample hard drive support, effective noise damping foam, high performance fans, and the option to be inverted into an alternative layout. Learn more at the link in the description below. The main reason to revisit these tests is to see if the shaders scale differently at the low end of the frequency range. It would make sense that at some point you would see shader scaling. Now we expect that in some compute tasks, as mentioned in the original content piece, maybe some kind of production workload, you would be more likely to see scaling, we would think. But we're not testing that today, we're testing gaming. And so far, there's not been scaling in gaming. So there's potential that we were either encountering some kind of pipeline bottleneck that we don't have a good way to define right now, or maybe on the upper end, an HBM2 bottleneck, where, as we all know, memory clock matters a whole lot more than core clock, so at 945 MHz core, maybe we were limited somewhere. And today's test is looking at more of that. So a couple things here. We're not going through 1050 MHz on all of the tests. It's really just the Vega 64 card right now. And then the 1400 MHz and 800 MHz low end will represent the bottom line of our scale testing. There's a little bit more territory to explore. None of our Vega 64 cards can clock as high as our Vega 56 cards. I've discussed this with a couple folks in the industry, some overclockers, some folks you are familiar with on the media side, and everyone I've spoken with seems to have a similar experience to ours, which is that so far, mods or not, we're able to get Vega 56 cards to clock higher. So this may be something to do with having fewer shaders, fewer cores, means that you can push the clock a bit higher. And while that's exciting from a Vega 56 standpoint, I mean, it further really drives emphasis that Vega 56 is a great card to play around with. Not as great as it could be with Unlocked BIOS, but pretty damn good. And if you're willing to play around with it, it's a good purchase, especially versus the existing 1070s. But that's not the point today. The point is, because Vega 64 isn't clocking as high on core as Vega 56, we're kind of limited on how high we can go right now. So we can hit about 1700 megahertz for Vega 64 when it's doing 3D Mark. Go a little beyond that with Liquid and power play tables, but once you start gaming, because of how the frequency behaves with games, often that drops to 1660. So that's where we land with 64, even though our 56 card can do 1742 and Firestrike and 1732 in games stable. So that's where we stand. But anyway, let's get through these. We'll start with 3D Mark. A lot of the emphasis was put on 3D Mark this time because we were trying to very rapidly create a line plot of scaling across different frequency ranges. It's a whole lot of testing. Each of these tests was executed a minimum of 6 times per rep, so to speak, or iteration. And then, I mean, based on what we saw at that point, either more tests were run or we averaged what we got. But we're going to start with 3D Mark. Lots to go through there. We'll go through a couple games, but that's a lot less the focus today. We're opening with Firestrike. 3D Mark Firestrike shows some of the most visible scaling with this new round of tests, so keep that in mind going forward. We'll lose resolution of difference on the shader impact as we explore more games. 3D Mark Firestrike scoring shows slightly more noticeable shader impact toward the low end when underclocking to 1395 MHz core and 800 MHz HBM2. As we move to 1590 MHz and 800 MHz HBM2, we're maintaining a somewhat equal distance as at 1395 MHz. Towards the higher end of the frequency scale, the lines merge closer to one another and start dithering around within margin of error territory demarcated by the vertical error bars. We haven't yet pushed Vega 56 to 1050 MHz HBM2, but we've included the Vega 64 data point for reference. Our performance flatlined for Vega 64 once we hit 1657 MHz core and 945 MHz HBM2. We still gained about 5.5% performance between the 945 MHz and 980 MHz numbers on Vega 64, but nothing close to the gains seen earlier in the line plot. Diminishing returns are encountered once we hit 1050 MHz on Vega 64, to the point where we do actually start losing some performance within margin of error though, so it's basically the same. Relating these scores into a more diluted FPS value, we can break things into FPS 1 and 2. GT1 in Firestrike relies heavily on loading the GPU with polys and primitives and tessellation, but doesn't apply much of a compute workload. GT2 increases compute task workloads and stresses memory harder, and knowing these two facts about 3D Mark's testing, we can better understand why each number behaves the way it does. Starting with GT1 FPS, the gap is largest at 1395 MHz core and 800 MHz HBM2. We're at 97 FPS for Vega 56 and 102 FPS for Vega 64, plus or minus some error in our clocks. And again, note that these are averaged from several test passes, but still, there's going to be error in there. That gives us about a 5% advantage for Vega 64, the shaders, so we can finally see a change here unlike the first round of tests. This is outside of our tolerance for clock error and 3D Mark variance. It appears that at these lower clocks we're seeing a lot more noticeable impact from the shader count increase on Vega 64 than previously, but it's still only 5%. That 5% gain largely persists to the 1589 MHz core and 800 MHz HBM2 class, where we still see about a 5 to 6% gain from the shader count. The difference begins to fall within error margins toward the higher end of the clock speeds, though overall maintains a slight 1 to 4% lead over Vega 56. There are times when the scores were effectively identical, as seen in our initial round of tests and in a couple of these other data points later on, and that falls within test variance and clock error margins. GT2, the second FPS score from 3D Mark, is more compute intensive than GT1, and these scores are nearly identical across the board. Vega 64 does not hold a significant lead in any of these tests except for the first two, where we clocked at 1395 MHz core and 1589 MHz core, both with 800 MHz HBM2. And again, the first number, 1395 and 800, is below what you'd get on Vega 56 out of box, so it's not really realistic. The second number, 1589 and 800, is also well below Vega 56's abilities with HBM2 in general, and certainly below Vega 64's. So given these numbers, we kind of know what to expect with games. In theory, at most you would expect about a 5 to 6% difference with those lower clocks, but as great as synthetic applications are for rapid fire testing and looking for theoretical scaling and theoretical performance and really pinpointing aspects of hardware, they aren't games. So let's go ahead and see how that worked out. Now, quick note here again, some games will have the higher overclocked tests, some won't. It just depended on which ones were stable on Vega 64 with the higher clocks. Not all of them could do it, and really if we started stepping down from the 1660 plus territory, you're getting so close to our original test value for the core that it just seemed kind of irrelevant. Applying this to games is where we start losing some of that test resolution in terms of looking for differences. For Honor at 4K plots us at around 47 to 48 FPS average with our original test battery, where we were around 1580 MHz and 945 MHz HBM2. At 1390 MHz core and 800 MHz HBM2 for each device, performance hovered around 42 FPS average for Vega 56 and around 43 FPS average for Vega 64. Note that Vega 64 was also running about 8 MHz faster. It's just this was the closest we can control it given the new Boost 3.0 equivalent clock behavior in Vega. So we're within error here. There's effectively no difference in For Honor at 4K with these clocks, looking at just the shaders. But then there are a lot of other elements of the card engaged when gaming, so it's tough to tell what other bottlenecks might be encountered, especially when we're looking at different resolutions like 4K. 1080p doesn't change much of this. Our original numbers were 137 FPS average already, and that's nearly dead 137 FPS average for each device. The 1% and 0.1% values were also close to each other, At 1390 to 1398 MHz core and 800 MHz HBM2, both Vega 56 and 64 are within 1 FPS of each other. We're within error margins here, again, and For Honor is exceptionally GPU bound as well, so we're not in a scenario where we're CPU bottlenecking. Ashes of the Singularity at 4K seems to be bottlenecking though, potentially on the CPU, and given how this title behaves, that makes some sense. Either that, or it was showing exceptionally limited differences. At 1390 MHz core and 800 MHz HBM2, the difference between the two GPUs is within margin of error here. That said, they are also not too distant from the 58 FPS average of the 1590 MHz core and 945 MHz HBM2 tests, so these differences are also within margins, just barely. We can't use this test for much, so let's just move on to Hellblade. Hellblade at 4K shows no scaling between the Vega 56 and Vega 64 cards when at 1580 to 1590 MHz core and 945 MHz HBM2. As discussed previously, it also shows no differences at 1390 core and 800 MHz HBM2, so once again, no real difference. Ghost Recon Wildlands at 4K again shows effectively no scaling at 1400 MHz core and 800 MHz HBM2, with our scores sitting within fractions of a frame of each other. At roughly 1590 and 945 MHz, we also see no scaling. This trend continues up to 1660 MHz core and 980 MHz HBM2 overclocks. Up to this point, all the testing was conducted a few weeks ago. It was before we left for the Linus Media Group shoot and before the 7980XE launch. We were about to publish the data more than 10 days ago at this point, but ended up holding publication until getting back so that we could add a couple more synthetic tests. The other part of our addendum went back to an initial plan of not flashing Vega 56 with Vega 64 BIOS and actually doing it. So we went back on that. We ended up flashing V64 onto V56, and then we ended up overclocking memory to 1020 MHz on each device, just for another point of comparison at the high end, using Heaven and Superposition. Heaven and Superposition were also the new options for the rest of the testing, and we added them because we thought they'd be more likely to draw out the differences. We performed Heaven testing using the Extreme preset, which is 1600 by 900, it's from 2009, and then we also ran custom testing at 1080p with Ultra preset configurations with anti-aliasing at 8x and DX11 for the API. We also manually adjusted tessellation across all options. We thought this might give some visibility as to a potential bottleneck in the geometry pipeline. Starting with the Extreme preset, which is again 1600 by 900, we'll use FPS to first show differences and then move on to scores. The Vega 56 card at 1390 MHz and 800 MHz HBM2 averages at 96.4 FPS after multiple passes, with Vega 64 at similar speeds averaging 96.1. These are functionally the same, particularly considering we're about 5 MHz lower on average with the Vega 64 card. With the BIOS flash on Vega 56 set to 1660 and 1020 MHz, we scored 112.05 FPS average, compared to 114.75 FPS average on Vega 64. That is now a 2.4% improvement with Vega 64, which is close to our earlier defined error margins, but also close enough to the limits that we can say a pattern is emerging. We'll keep this 2.4% advantage in mind for now, as it may come into play as we collect more data. With 1080p testing and tessellation scaling, we're seeing these results. At 1660 MHz and 1020 MHz for HBM2, the Vega 64 card operates with a score of 3050.7 versus 3017 on Vega 56, or an increase of 1.1%. The gap widens as we increase tessellation to moderate, and that results in a score difference of 2801.5 on Vega 64 versus 2730.5 on Vega 56, or a 2.6% improvement on Vega 64. Normal tessellation also posts a 2.6% difference, and that's at 2628.5 versus 2561.5. Extreme tessellation has us at 2.9% improved with Vega 64, showing one of the biggest gains we've seen thus far. Given the consistency of these results, we can safely say that the Vega 64 card's extra CUs do help in this particular game, or benchmark rather, and we're somewhere between 1 and 3% for gains depending on the test settings. As for the 1390 and 800 MHz clocks, the scoring is roughly the same across the board. We're within tolerance for error and the 5 MHz clock difference here. Unlike Firestrike, the results appear to be mostly the same at the low-end clocks when testing with Heaven. And one more final note, although we like to do this testing to try and determine differences in shaders, and that's kind of the verbiage I've been using throughout this video, talking about shader differences, what we're really testing is CU differences. Each CU contains more than just shaders, like texture units, for example, so other elements of the CU can come into play before the shaders do, but at our level, we have no way to isolate beyond CUs. So we can't control for individual shaders or texture units or things like that. As for Superposition, this is made by the same company that made Heaven. It's just been updated for the modern era. As such, it demonstrates largely the same performance. It's built on the same engine as Heaven was. It's still tessellation and poly heavy, so no surprise there. We're seeing about a 3% improvement with Vega 64 over Vega 56 with both sets of numbers for this synthetic benchmark. And these benchmarks, they're good tools for demonstrating these differences, but if you can't realize them in games, it's kind of hard to say when they appear. And it probably comes down to certain compute workloads. We would wager you might see these differences, the 3% differences here, more in something like maybe Sniper Elite or that new Forza game or something that uses a lot of async if those types of games tap into these shaders. That's kind of what we would wager at this point. But either way, with the synthetic workloads that really exaggerate things, Superposition is still showing about a 3% difference, so not a huge one for sure, and really not that distant from our 2 to 2.5% error tolerance, given that we can't perfectly control the clocks from run to run. So we're seeing some scaling in 3D Mark Firestrike GT1, which is poly and tessellation heavy, and we're not seeing much scaling outside of this. This test isn't fully complete. I mean, you'd have to test every game basically to really concretely and confidently state where and when shaders make a difference. Clearly there are places where it can if we look at the 3D Mark results. Those are highly repeatable, and we see some differences at the very low end of the clocks towards 1400 megahertz. So it's unrealistically low that we're seeing the difference emerge, but it does emerge. And that means that one could expect that some type of game out there programmed similarly to this application would behave similarly. There's also room for production applications to show some shader differences. We didn't test those today. Maybe something with compute, although it wasn't reflected in Firestrike, maybe something with compute-heavy workloads would have those differences emerge. And ultimately, this test is kind of difficult to conduct anyway. It's very time consuming because you have to log the frequency during the test, which changes. It changes because of how Vega behaves now. It changes based on the game. If we set, let's say we set a number like 1422 megahertz target, that might get you 1390 to 1398 megahertz if you're lucky, if it's going well. Or it might get you 1422. Just depends on the application. And so that might be 1390 in application A, For Honor or something, and then application B, maybe Hellblade, you're at 1380. So there's a lot of work of adjusting the clocks to make sure that they're the same on each card, because each card behaves differently, just like NVIDIA GPUs now, and that makes it tedious to test properly. That said, the biggest takeaway here, I think, we've kind of learned indirectly as an aside from this, is that Vega 56, from our testing with our samples, which are not representative of every single sample on Earth, but representative of at least 1% of them, since that's about the amount of cards we have from Vega 56 versus the initial launch. In our testing so far, it looks like Vega 56 is capable of achieving at least slightly higher clocks than Vega 64. BuildZoid is still exploring this personally. His initial findings were similar, but he only just recently got his Vega 56 in, so there's room for him to discover more things. I'm sure he'll do videos on it. Check them out when he does. I've spoken with vendors in the industry who work with these cards, and they've seen similar. I've spoken with other media, they've seen similar. So it would appear that there's a kind of expected hit to maximum clock potential with the increased shader count. That's not wholly absurd. There's probably some sort of thermal behavior where you've got higher density of active shaders wiggling around. It's basically what they do. And that's limiting the clock headroom on 64 on our cards. There's room for that to be different for other cards. But that's what we're seeing. So that also makes it difficult to test the higher frequency results, because with 56, we're doing 1732 to 1742 with the mods. 64 with the same mods, or similar anyway, we're doing like 1700 to 1712 at best. And once you get into games, it falls down around 1660, and in a couple games, that's not even stable. So that's kind of interesting. That's maybe the more interesting takeaway than the shader differences. But for now, that's what it looks like. So this really just kind of interesting information, not necessarily stuff you can act on. If you did want to act on it, I would say that once again, it looks like Vega 56 is the far better buy than Vega 64. It's competitive with the 1070. It's pretty modifiable if you're willing to do things like registry edits. You can just double click a file basically. And if you're willing to maybe get a better cooler on it, whether that's DIY or AIB partner, whatever, you can get pretty far with that card. It's fun to play with, but it does require playing with it for it to be the best it can be. And that's not just like a normal overclock. It's, you either undervolt it to tune it down in power consumption, or you clock it up and compete more directly in frame rate, things like that. So it's very much a card where to get the most out of it, you have to enjoy being under the hood. There are a lot of people in our audience who do, so Vega 56 is pretty fun to work with for that. But still, shader difference, don't worry about it right now. You can subscribe for more. Patreon.com/GamersNexus to help us out directly, as always. GamersNexus.net for the website. And you can go to gamersnexus.squarespace.com to pick up a shirt like this one, or one of our cooler designs like the Graph logo. I'll see you all next time.